Hi, this is Miss Nelson, and welcome to the Context for London by William Blake. All images used in this PowerPoint are of the public domain. In today's PowerPoint, we're going to be looking at the poet, the era that the poem was written in, and the Romanticism movement. Now, William Blake was a poet who was largely overlooked in his life, but in death, he's considered a very prominent figure in the Romantic poets movement. He was actually swept up in a lot of riots that protested ideas that showed the government were trying to limit the freedom of its people. He was actually involved in the Gordon riots that protested the subjugation of the Catholic side of Christianity. So he was actually in a riot for people who were trying to stop people from being Catholics. He was an admirer of the French revolutions, and he often wrote about kings or queens that preached about suppressing any form of freedom. So he was actually a big fan of the idea of overthrowing the monarchy. He had big issues with the idea of class power and privilege. His biggest problem was around organised religion. He wasn't against religion, but he had an issue with people who claimed to do ill work in a religious name. He disliked people overlooking certain classes and not helping in need. So what he thought was that the Catholic Church were not helping poor people effectively, and it really bothered him, especially when children were involved. Now, George III was the most prominent monarch of Blake's time. He was a devout religious man and was alive and reigning during some of Britain's most trying times. You've probably heard about him in My Last Duchess. He was adamant that members of the royal family were not allowed to marry outside of their own class. This was sparked by his brother marrying someone that was not of the upper class. Surprisingly, despite being very unpopular, this bill passed. So it was actually illegal during his reign for people of the royal family to marry anyone who was not upper class. Now, the American War of Independence was fought during his reign. America wanted to separate from Britain and become its own nation. This was a colossal loss for George III, and it was actually considered one of his greatest losses of power. He was surprisingly a popular king at times. Through some actions in those he appointed into Parliament, he became very well liked and was considered to treat people in humane ways. The French Revolution happened during his reign, and he'd fight against France in the Napoleonic Wars following this state of unrest. There was a lot of concern about this because taxes increased to fund the war. He was seen as a man who had more interest in social class and politics than mundane people, and this is why a lot of people mocked him in their poetry. Now, the Romantic poets, not as the name would suggest, they didn't write poems about romance, but they were actually a big movement that believed in the expression of emotion and a focus on the freedom that you'd have. A lot of Romantic poetry centred around the idea of nature and the appreciation of it. Due to the fact that the Industrial Revolution was happening around the time that this movement was created, a lot of poets wanted to discuss their feelings on this apparent disrespect of nature, and we can see Blake doing this in London. It was a movement that embodied spiritual discovery, intellectual thought and individuality. It encouraged poets, artists, writers to experience all aspects of the emotional state, including the negative ones, which up until now had not been prevalent or popular in poetry. So this movement wasn't just limited to poets. Lots of artists and writers got involved as well. Ideally, the Romantics wanted a lot of political change. They wanted all people to be able to have a good quality of life. And this was not just limited to Britain. This was a movement that spanned the globe. So all artists and poets and writers from across the world were involved in the Romanticism movement. Okay, what's left? As usual, try to revise these 3 points. For every quote you look at, try to create a sentence that includes one of these 3 key points of information. Try to further your research on these 3 topics: the poet himself, William Blake, George III, and the Romanticism movement. Now that you know all this, good luck.